Hi, Jennifer. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Amy. I'm so glad to be here. Part two.
Part two. Yes. Today we're going to dive into all of the hows. We talked about the who, the what, the why this is so important to raising sexually healthy children, and why this starts with the at home with the parents, why this starts with us. And today we get to dive into some of the nitty gritty how, which I'm very excited about. And for those of you just tuning in, this is part two of raising sexually healthy children and how we're doing that as stay-at-home moms and full-time parents. And if you haven't listened, please go back and listen to part one. Jennifer gives us a beautiful introduction to herself and her background, what she's been doing up to this point and what she's continuing to do, still furthering her certifications on this topic and further helping other people. So I encourage you to go back and listen to part one of this episode. But that being said, you left us with an amazing teaser the other day. And I don't know if you want to dive into that now.
I don't know what you're talking about.
So for those of you that didn't listen, or those of you that didn't, as a reminder, Jennifer told us that today we're going to figure out how to strike the word virgin from our vocabulary. And so
Yes.
we're going to dive into some terminology today. I'm hoping we can get some book recommendations from you, some resources, and just tips and tools from all of your knowledge and resources, and you can help us. And then from there, we can contact you to dive in a little bit deeper. So Jennifer, I'm going to kind of let you talk a little bit today, and I'll ask a few questions here and there and dive in. So I'm going to kind of let you decide, where do you want to start with this today? Because it's such a big topic.
Well, since you've tickled everybody with the virgin statement, why don't we just start there?
Yeah.
Just the word, how many times, if I had $1 for every time someone in my practice has said, I lost my virginity too. And what a horrible, if you just sit with that for a moment, first of all, it implies that we've lost something, instead of implying that we've embarked on a new sort of debut in our lives, that we've gone to a different place that we haven't been to before. And it also sort of puts all this pressure on this one event. It also has all these connotations of religion and a woman's worth in terms of her virginity. And, that has to do with, of course, ancient history, as well as purity culture, that a woman isn't much more than, her virginal status. And so it also kind of turns sex into something like an object. I've lost it. Mm-hmm. So really what we know is it's a demeaning term, and it serves no one. Absolutely no one. So really in academia and the literature, I adopted the phrase that they use, which is your sexual debut. So when I work with people and they say, I lost my virginity, I say, so your sexual debut was at age 18. And I explain to them why I use that term. Mm-hmm. So if we want to continue the narrative that someone's first experience with sex has to do with something that they've lost, that is not a good place to start. Mm-hmm. So that's why it needs to go.
And don't you feel, from my perspective and just kind of dissecting that, for me, I guess in my mind, it just really puts it up on this huge pedestal. It just makes it seem like this just super, not that sex and your first time isn't this big deal, right? But by saying it in the way that you're describing, it's
that I've lost something, that it is a big deal, right? Yes. It can be a big deal, right? And that's okay. But when we describe it as this thing that happened, I've lost, it's a terrible equation to start with.
Yeah. And you think of it too. This is just me, but when I think of virgin, I think of female. And that's not the case. It's male and female. But for some reason, we hold females in such high regard if they are a quote virgin.
And
And
we've
it,
also fetishized that as well.
yes, yes. And
Yes.
it needs, I agree with you. Like it
Yeah.
needs to go away,
Needs
because
to go.
you're not more valuable as a human being if you've had your sexual debut or not. You are still a
Right.
valuable,
Exactly.
still a very valuable, equally valuable, no more, no less human being,
Exactly.
if you've experienced that or not. So I love
Right.
that.
You're not a chewed piece of gum because you've just
Yeah,
made a choice to
yeah,
have a sexual experience. There's
yeah.
actually, I did a post. As I told you last time, I'm in my certification process for sex and faith counselorship. And I was doing some research and found that the word virgin in its sort of its original dictionary version actually means a untethered, independent woman.
Mm,
I was like,
okay.
wow, that's the original meaning. Like that's fantastic. Um,
Great.
and so here we've look what we've done to it. So I thought, so my post was about how we as a culture are not ready to retake that word back because we are still so stuck in this context of virginity being something that we've lost and
Mm-hmm.
connected to religious undertones and all that stuff. So, but I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And so I would be curious, where in history have we now taken this term and created what we have now? And you're right, it's so indoctrinated in our culture that we, at this point, at this junction, we can't turn
Not yet.
back.
We're not there
Yeah.
yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
like that. I love that term, sexual debut. I think as
Mm-hmm.
parents, knowing that now, if you have young children and starting to, use that and just getting virgin out, just cutting it out of our vocabulary makes so much more sense. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And is it, I mean, just even saying it, sexual debut, that just sounds so much better.
Yeah. So how do your clients accept that when you're talking to them about it? Are they like shocked? Oh, wow.
Kind
That's,
of
I
like
really
you and
love
I
that.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're like, yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And especially if some of them have come in, whether they've been sort of entangled in, the purity culture, or patriarchal messages, just that oppression of women. When I say that to them, that, hey, this is not a word that we want to be perpetuating, and give them this new definition, they're all like, wow. Or when I'm talking about raising sexually healthy children, same thing. They're like, wow, that is so much healthier. It's
Hmm.
like, yes, it is. So yeah,
Yes.
I don't know that I've encountered anyone that didn't feel that that was a good idea.
That's good. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about terminology. Let's just dive into that a little bit. And we've already talked about in our first episode, part 1, the importance of terminology, but let's dive into some specific terms that we're using. I've used, and when we've had our initial conversations, I've used them. I don't want to say incorrectly, but kind of incorrectly. And so I want to do better, and I want listeners to be able to know they can change their
Sure.
terminology, and what the impact of just shifting your vocabulary can do. So do you have a couple you want to share with us?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm sure
Sure.
you have like
And
a
just
dictionary.
I got a whole dictionary. And just before I even jump into that, something you just said, I want to kind of put a warm blanket around your listeners right now and say, if people are listening and worried that they've been saying the wrong things, or they're worried that they've missed the boat, what I want to say is, you don't know what you don't know. And most of us, the majority of us, have been brought up in a culture like you and I talked about last time, that is sex saturated and sex silent. So we are seeing all these things in our lives, but we are really not having any conversations at home. And so we now, those of us who are parents, just cut yourself a little slack in terms of, no one taught you. And if you weren't taught and you don't have the skills, don't expect yourself to be like, oh my gosh, I haven't been doing this. Why haven't I been doing this? No one taught you.
Hmm.
But now is the time. Now that you know better, now is the time to make those
Mm-hmm.
changes. So with regards to terminology, the best thing, especially for the kind of that under 5 set, under 2 set, it's critically important that we make sure that we call every body part the body part's name. So, we wouldn't call this a bendy or elbow. We would call it an elbow. And so therefore, and we don't want to call that area between a biological female's legs, a vagina. We want to call it a vulva, because the vagina is just a hole in a small part of all of that area. And a vulva also, if we're thinking in terms of positive sexual health and pleasure, it's also really where for a female the pleasure is mostly on the outside. So that whole area, anatomical correct language, is the vulva. And then they should know all the body part names for everyone, not just for themselves or their own gender, for everyone. I think it's really important that we grow children to have empathy for everyone's body, and therefore they should know how they work. I taught my boys all about menstruation, reproduction, what happens. I'll be honest, I'm a perimenopausal woman right now, and explaining to my sons what that means. My sons are teenagers now. Had a big talk with my son about it in the car, about what does that mean? And you know what he said? He says, wow, Mom, it's like a reverse puberty. I'm like, yes, it is.
Oh, light bulb.
Very,
I love that.
Yeah, right. A big light bulb. He was like, yeah. And I was like, yeah. And it's equally as difficult and challenging at times. So again, that empathy. So super important that they know that. And, making sure a penis is a penis. It is not a hose. It is not a Johnson. It is not every other word you can think of. An anus is an anus. There's no other need to call it anything else, because when we do call any of those body parts something other than what they are, that is shame, because you have to ask yourself, why wouldn't I call that body part the name? So that's what I usually suggest parents do. If you find yourself using other language for body parts, stop and ask yourself, am I doing this in the best interest of my child because, that's what it is anatomically correct? No, it's usually out of their own embarrassment, or that they are somehow feeling shame about those body parts.
Where do you think that embarrassment? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer. I was just thinking, where do you think that embarrassment comes from? That do you think that's just indoctrinated in us, or we just kind of grew up that way and we don't know any better? Or, because it is like at times, I've made a big shift in how I talk to the girls. We made a great big shift, and Brad's even fully on board, and he's using the term vulva. I mean, we're being very anatomically, like you said, correct with that. But it originally almost was like an embarrassment, or it was almost like we wanted to make it easier for the girls to understand, but instead it was almost more confusing. So
absolutely. Yeah. And that's what we think. We could go way back. I mean, it's patriarchal, it's puritanical, early puritanical views. It's that dissociation from body and soul with regards to history and religion, and it's oppressive. It's oppression culture for women, and it just oppression culture of our sexuality, because we don't believe that people can control their sexual urges. And so there's a lot of history there. But I think for us, currently, a lot of us, it's that our parents never taught us. Therefore, again, why would we know how to do this?
Yeah. Okay. So it's not bits and pieces. It's not hose. It's vulva. It's penis. It's
scrotum, it's anus, it's breasts, it's buttocks.
Okay. And I think it's interesting, and maybe this is just me, but I didn't know the term until we had started talking. I didn't know to call it vulva, because I was having that conversation with Brad. We have daughters, and I said, well, it's not their vagina. when we're talking about this.
Right.
And then part of what I was seeking was the answer to this question, like, well, what do we call it? And I
Right.
probably could have Googled it, but I mean, I wouldn't have wanted that in my Google search, who knows what would have popped up. But so, I mean, that was one of my biggest questions for you, is like, what do I call this? What do I call this for myself? I didn't even know what to call it for myself. So that, to me, just having a name, just having a term for it, an actual term, was
Yes.
so eye-opening and so enlightening.
And if we want to be fully sex positive and we want to fully empower girls and young women and encourage that they have agency in their relationships and that they are part of sexual relationships from the time that they're young, we'll also let them know part of that vulva is their labia as well as their clitoris, which is a
Mm-hmm.
place that feels good when we touch it.
Mm-hmm.
So that is when I think one of the most criminal offenses that we do to young girls and young women is we never teach them that they have access to pleasure in their
Mm-hmm.
own bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So again, they grow up believing and learning that their role in a sexual relationship is to serve, is
Mm-hmm.
to give, is to pleasure other.
Mm-hmm.
So that's super important too.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about the anatomical terms. Do you have any others in that way? I know you and I have talked about using the term tickle and how
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
not appropriate. So could you dive into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, because I think we know that tickle in our culture, is touching someone with your fingers to make them laugh, etc. But if we're using tickle as a way to talk about pleasure with ourselves, it's just like anything else. It's just ambiguous for children. And because they can be very concrete at the young age, we want to make sure that we're making it as clear as possible. Just like you and I think briefly talked about how I said, when we're saying to a child that, touching your penis or your vulva feels good, and that's something you do in your bedroom alone in private. That I always say in your bedroom alone in private, because most kids don't even know what private means. They're not
Mm-hmm.
sure what that means. So we explain that. So I'm trying to think, there was another word I know you and I had talked about that I'm trying to remember. And even the word appropriate and inappropriate, that's something that I think is just, is something that I've learned over 2,000 people going through my workshops and hearing those two words over and over and over again. And what I realized is when we use the word inappropriate or appropriate, when we're talking about behavior, it doesn't give children an understanding of what they either did right, they did wrong, is not okay. So
Mm-hmm.
if you asked a child, what does appropriate mean? I don't even know that an adult would know immediately what to say. So when we can say, instead of that's inappropriate, instead of saying touching your penis in the grocery store is something we do at home, not
Mm-hmm.
here in the grocery store. That tells them exactly what you want them to do and gives them direction. If you just looked at them and said that's inappropriate, shame, gives them no direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So if we can also try to strike over time,
Yeah.
inappropriate and appropriate, that would be great too, because it leaves them without a direction.
Right. Yeah. And to me, it seems like it almost appropriate seems like it's right. Inappropriate makes it seem like it's
Exactly, is
wrong.
wrong.
And
Right.
that
There's a
is,
judgment there.
there's a judgment. Exactly. And it's also fairly biased. What somebody deems appropriate, somebody may deem
Right.
inappropriate. And that goes back to your values and your
Mm-hmm.
cultural beliefs and a lot of and just how you grew up. So that's
Right.
that could be very opinionated too. So by
Right.
saying that's something that we do in the bedroom, in private at home, is much more
Mm-hmm.
appropriate. And for tiny children, especially young kids, I can definitely see how that would be incredibly confusing. I'm guilty of it. I just said it to you.
Right. And it sneaks out all the time. But if we can
Yeah.
be more aware of it, and especially with our children, it's just going to give them more direction.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I did want to mention is that a lot of people don't really realize that, we are sexual beings from conception. We have sonograms of baby fetus boys touching their penises and rubbing themselves. And we know that a female child's vagina lubricates at 6 months. And so we know that we are sexual beings. And so making sure that we are aware of that from the time that we give birth to our child. I always like to say that the way that we hold our children, the way that we caress lovingly their bodies, the way that we clean them, all of that shows love and through touch. And so we also want to make sure that when we are changing them and doing those things, that we're not swatting their hands away when they're touching themselves, that to let them know that exploring their body is actually something extreme. It's a developmental milestone, needs to happen, and is super healthy. And as long as they grow, we set healthy boundaries around that, around where to do that. That's going to keep shame out of the equation and going to teach them healthy sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So again, I wanted to just bring up the point that it starts from the time that they're born and even before.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I don't know if we had touched on that in part 1, because I think by talking about that and making sure that parents know that your children are born this way, whether they're male or female, they're born with these sensations. They're born with
Right.
these nerves that create a sensation of pleasure. And so when you start seeing your child like rubbing on furniture when they're very young, or boys touching themselves, even girls touching themselves, like, don't be shocked. I mean, you might be sort of surprised because you didn't really expect that. But if you can understand why, you're not going to immediately go over and be like, no, 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 no. Don't do that. Don't touch yourself. You can't do that. Or like you said, like moving their hand away when you're changing. You can understand that, well, mom, dad, they're actually born with all of these feelings, all of these nerves. And I, as a mom of girls, I hope I don't touch on this too often, but I do think it's very important for people to know that females actually have more nerve endings
That's right.
than boys do. So girls are literally, we talk about this, and I wasn't going to dive into it too deep, but I do think it's relevant and important to understand that females are built for pleasure. Like, we are designed for pleasure, and we have more pleasure opportunities. I don't know if that's the right term, than men do, than boys do. So I should say males do, based on how we were created. So
I can only agree with you with that.
yeah. So, and that's not something they talk about in school. Those aren't things that they share with you and talk about in school, and letting you know that, these things are okay. And then when you become a parent, you're shocked. Like I said, your kids are walking around touching themselves or rubbing on things,
and it's so common. I can't even tell you the amount. It's funny, the stories I've always heard of rubbing on the coffee table and rubbing on like things like pillow pets, like those pillows. And like these things are super common. And just like there are emotional milestones and there are physical milestones, there are sexual milestones. All of these things are what grows a child up into becoming an adult, a functioning adult. And part of that, as we know, is our sexuality. There's sort of a funny saying in sex therapy that when sex is good, it's 10% of your relationship. When sex is bad, it's 90%. And and it just illustrates just how important our sexuality, this wellspring of creativity and joy and energy is. And it demands our respect and our curiosity.
Yeah. And there were a couple things that you and I had talked about before. I mean, so in our house, I don't want to go too much into what we do because it is pretty private within our household. I shared with you pretty openly. But, if the girls are curious or whatever, our household, I don't know, philosophy, rule, approach is that they go into the bedroom or a private area, and then just explaining that and addressing it in a really positive way, instead of shaming, like you said. And this
Right.
all goes back to intentionality and taking a pause as a parent, as a mom, because these are mostly mothers that are listening,
Yeah.
and analyzing the situation, understanding the why behind it, which we've talked about. And then now you can approach it rationally using the correct terminology that we've discussed, and then think about what you want to, how you want to approach it within your own household, because it's going to be different based on your values.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the big key is not to react. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
react negatively. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
what are you doing? Or anything. That's where shame comes in.
Mm-hmm.
But if we walk in and say, oh, what's happening here today?
Mm-hmm.
Something like that, lighthearted. Um, we just want to make sure there's going to be enough situations in our lives where shame creeps in. But if we can mindfully keep it out of our sex lives for our children, for their sex lives, it will make a world of difference.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I have that inside understanding, having sat with clients, day after day, talking about their these experiences that happened to them as children that have stuck with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want any more children to have to struggle with that than we already have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we're talking about raising sexually healthy children, and we've talked about how that starts at home with us as parents, so we have the terminology, we have the intentionality, but where do we go from here? What's kind of our next step in creating that sex positive environment?
Sure. One thing that's really important is we want to make sure that we are an approachable parent, whether you call yourself askable or approachable,
Mm-hmm.
but somebody who your child knows that they can come to and you won't react adversely. That if they come to you and say, what is fuck? Because I've had that question.
Mm-hmm.
Or what is vulva? Or what is this? Or mom, I heard blowjob on the bus. That we don't go, what? Where did you hear that?
Mm-hmm.
That immediately will cause them to back away.
Oh yeah.
What we want to say is, wow, that's a really good question. Tell me more. Try to keep the interrogation words out, the who, what, where, why. Who did you get that from? Where, why? That causes a child to sort of back away and shut down. But if you can say, wow, that's a good question. Tell me more about it. Tell me more about what you know, and I'll fill in the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And then we listen. And then we follow through with what an answer is. And for any kids, I would say under the age of 9, don't go any further than 3 sentences. A lot of times we get that opportunity. We think it's knocking. We think we have to say, all of sexuality in that time. We really just want to answer the question. And then if they're older, that age group, you can maybe go to, 5 sentences, but we don't want to overwhelm. And then we always just want to check for comprehension. So
Mm-hmm.
does that make sense to you? Or do you understand that? Do you want any more information? So one of the great important foundational pieces is be askable or approachable. Be that parent who your child can come to, because what I can tell you is if you're not that when they're young, as I said earlier, when the stakes get higher, they're not going to come to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the last thing that we want.
Mm-hmm.
We want them to come to us when they have a relational problem or a fear, or they're in some sort of difficulty or trouble, or they want to learn about birth control or whatever it is. You want them to come to you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't want them to come to you, please make sure that they have another trusted adult that they can.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good first foundational piece, is making sure that you are askable and approachable.
And approachable. I tend to
Yes.
probably say too much. They ask a question and then I say
We
too
all
much.
do.
So I love the 3 sentences sort of rule, and then check in with
Yep.
that, let that
Mm-hmm.
marinate, see how they respond, and then go from there. Don't just continue to talk because you feel like you need to keep explaining it so oh, here's the big debut, here's the big question, and we have to have all of
Right.
the conversation about it
Say
right
it
now.
all.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not just give them a little bit of information, let it sink in, see how it goes. Like you said, make sure that they retain it or don't have any other questions, and then see what happens. So
And see what happens.
that being said, At what age do you sort of start bringing this up? You know, you kind of mentioned if you hear it on the school bus or if you hear it here, then they approach you. But at what point do you take proactive approaches as a parent and start having these conversations?
If you want it to go smoothly, if you want sexuality, as I said, it's like any other developmental growth. If you want it to be a normative part of your family culture and who they are, the best thing to do is start from birth. Like I said, everything from your values, what you're thinking about in terms of your child, how you touch them, how you show them love. And then from there, again, that's scaffolding. So by age 3, you're reading books with them about bodies, about body autonomy, bodily autonomy, about how bodies work. And then when they, every year as they age, you're adding a little bit more information. And then at age 7, 8, and 9, you're going to start talking about puberty. And so it starts from the very beginning, from the time that they're born. You can begin to teach consent to a 2-year-old, about maybe they're sharing toys or not sharing, and teaching them about how we ask and how we, request something. That's the beginnings of consent. So I think it's starting from as young as you possibly can. And then, of course, if you're tardy to the party, no worries, but jump in. Now that now that you're hearing this, jump in. And there are many developmentally structured books about these topics that are great to sort of guide you. So for one example is the Roby Harris series, which is the first one for ages 3 to 7 is It's Not the Stork. And from 4 to 7, It's So Amazing. And then from 10 and up is It's Perfectly Normal. So what's great about that series is it's broken down exactly by stages, so easy to use. And there are many other resources. That's just one that is very, discreet in terms of the age groups, and it's super healthy. And I usually recommend that parents read them first themselves so they can get in touch with their own values first, get in touch with what material is in there, and then read it to their children. And I usually recommend that no one particular book will fully represent the beautiful and colorful and unique landscape that is every family. And so adding in that maybe if there's something missing in there, maybe, I don't know, you're reading a book and maybe you have a child who's intersex, which means that they have genitalia potentially of both genders. And if you're not reading about that, or if your child that came into the world through a surrogate or an egg donor or a sperm donor, making sure that you're adding that in. That is the unique way that this child came into a family. So I think that's really critically important, is making sure that not only that the child knows that they're represented, but also that we are also, again, learning about other folks in the world.
Yeah. And we may not understand the impact of reading those stories to them right away, but as the kids get older, this is just my take on it. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but as they get older, they're going to remember some of those stories, and they may not remember that specific story, but it's already ingrained in their brain that this is how this person came into the world. This is how this person was created. This is what they were born with. And so then there isn't this, what? I've never heard of that before. It's like, no, you've actually already heard of it. So it's not that shock maybe, or surprise or whatever. We've already talked about it. We've already read about it. Yeah. So, and I
to your point,
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just going to say, to your point about, kind of giving them information, if you want to be their source, you have to get there first. And we know that kids are learning information so early. If they have access to an iPad or a computer that doesn't have a monitoring program on it, they have a passport to the world.
Yeah.
And so I get calls from parents who need a consult that, their 8-year-old found porn and, kind of they're freaked out about it and what to do. So if you want them to have information that is solid, that is medically accurate, and that also has your values on board, get to them first. And again, so back to our original point, the earlier the better.
Mm-hmm. So I was thinking as you were talking about that porn, there's kind of this idea amongst parents that if you're having sex, oh, we can't let the kids hear. Don't let the kids hear. I don't want the kids to hear me. So what is your response to that? Because you hear it all the time. I hear from all my friends. Brad and I are guilty of it. I'll just be really transparent. But at the same time, we've had the conversation like, but this is normal. Like
This is, and let's even get rid of normal. This
oh
is, this
yeah,
is
yeah.
healthy and
This is healthy.
biologically what we do, right?
Yes, yes.
And what I suggest to people, again, being educating our kiddos for what they will eventually encounter themselves, is that parents, I remember, actually, I'll use an example. I remember that when my kids were little, and they, one more story, come on, can't we stay up later? Can't we read one more thing? And I would say to them that it's really important for parents to have their alone time. Just like we love you, it's important that we love each other and that we have time together to do that. So I taught them about privacy that way. I taught them about what a closed door might mean, and letting them know that, at some point they know, just when they're 3 to 7 years old and they're reading the Roby Harris book with you, or you're reading it to them at that age, that's what it's teaching them, is that people do. That's how reproduction happens. And so they already know that. And so with regards to behavior and at home, it's critically important that kids learn about intimacy, that they learn about what intimacy is outside the bedroom, and they learn about that there's intimacy inside the bedroom. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean all the facts when they're young, but teaching them that, I guess I'm bringing this up because I've had some clients too many who have said to me, I never saw my parents show any intimacy with each other. Yeah. And that negatively impacted them greatly. Mm-hmm. So what that can teach them is the only way they know how to show affection is in the bedroom. And what we know is people want affection outside the bedroom too. But again, they never witnessed it. So they didn't grow up with those role models. So if we can role model for our children healthy intimacy, meaning just loving, touching, romantic, hugging, kissing, that sort of thing, that's super healthy. And then also letting them know that, yes, how you came into the world, potentially, depending on how they came into the world, mm-hmm. Means that we've had sex or making love or whatever we want to call it, that has happened, and make that normative for them, healthy, no shame. And earlier we talked about, about being askable and approachable. I just want to throw in there, because there's always some parents who say, but what about my kid who never asked questions? And I'm like, absolutely. There are lots of kids who will never ask questions. One, because they just don't, like it's their personality. And two, they may have experienced you once or twice as not sort of approachable, so they've shut down. Or they're just maybe don't know what they don't know. And so for those folks, for those parents who are in that type of situation, the tricky thing is that they actually have a little bit more work to do, meaning they have to actually approach their kids timely and often. So they have to have read some of the books, know the developmental sexual stages, so they are giving those kids the information that they need. Mm-hmm. So I just want to bring that up, because some parents are like, wait a minute, but what do I do if my child doesn't ask? That it just means you just have to bring it to them.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Definitely, like at some point we do have to be, for all parents, I think, a little more proactive. We have to kind of take a proactive approach to it. And some parents, like you were saying, may have to do that more than others. Right. You may have a child that asks you 10,000 questions, and you're actually like, we're not going to discuss that today at this time. So I guess maybe that's another question for you, is if you have a child that asks all the questions, how do you set a healthy boundary in saying, I think we're done talking about this today, without shutting them down, or let's take a pause and revisit this at a different time? I've even told the girls, I'm not exactly sure how to answer your question right now. So mommy needs a little bit of time to think about this, and then we'll talk about it
Beautifully
later.
said.
Okay.
Absolutely beautifully
Yeah.
said. Because you're not going to be able to, you may not have the answer a lot of times. So
Mhm.
always know that you can defer, meaning just saying, you know what, we're going to eat dinner in 10 minutes. And then after dinner, I'm going to think about that question and then we'll talk about it.
Mhm.
If we want to remain, if we want street cred with our kids,
Mhm.
we have to make sure we revisit it.
Mhm.
Definitely revisit it. And I think you did a good job and you just role modeled that well for your listeners around saying, sometimes we just don't have time to answer all your questions, but what's the flip side of that that's super important is we want to make sure that we always celebrate their curiosity.
Mhm.
We celebrate and love their curiosity. And we want to make sure, when we're giving responses to questions that what we know about that when we do respond to our kids and we give them answers, that positive and developmentally relevant responses to kids' questions lays the foundation for sexual health, developing healthy body image, life skill building, ability to talk about sexuality later in their lives. So again, the earlier that you start, the easier it is for them and for you, and it sets the tone for all the conversations that are to come in puberty and early adulthood.
Mhm.
So responding to our kids is important. We can't just say, oh yeah, good question, we'll get back to that, and then
Mhm.
never go back to it.
Mhm.
You'll lose credibility.
Yeah. Okay. That makes complete sense.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go in and ask kind of like a tough question now. So if there
Sure.
is an inappropriate situation that's happened, how do you talk to your kids about it at that point? Because a lot of times kids, especially when they're very young, under, we'll say 9, especially, and even we'll take the age out of it. I mean, really, you could divide it up into 2 age groups, but they have a really hard time discussing it. If you feel like something inappropriate has happened or inappropriate that's happened to them, or maybe they've done something inappropriate, how do you dive into that
So when you're saying
conversation?
inappropriate, are you meaning like unhealthy?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes. Oh my
Okay.
goodness. There we go. Ah,
Because even
okay.
me, I was sitting there going, I wonder what she means by that.
Yeah, unhealthy.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for
Okay,
clarifying.
unhealthy. Yep.
Absolutely. Unhealthy. How do you approach that situation?
It kind of depends on the situation, but if you are walking in on something that you're uncertain about, whether it's kids playing doctor, and of course, I think maybe we touched on this last time. I don't know if we did, but it's really the important things are that they are close in age, meaning under 4 years apart, and that there isn't any coercion, there isn't duress happening, no one's being forced, and that there's just curiosity going on and touching, that no one's trying to sort of mimic more adult behaviors, penetration behaviors. And in that case, how you want to react is like, I probably say something like, oh, looks like we're being curious about bodies today.
Mm.
Let's get your clothes on and let's go upstairs and have a cookie. And then maybe over a cookie, I might say something like, hey, remember at the Wiessner household, we keep our clothes on at play dates. And then what I would probably do is after the child leaves, I would debrief it with my own child and just say, hey, what was happening today? Looks like you were having fun. I'm just wondering what was going on. And then I would also certainly share that with the other child's parent.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just letting them know what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not something to be reactive about when it's that way. Now, if there was something where there was, there are tears and there maybe was coercion, or you find out afterwards that there was coercion, or if they're, more than 4 years apart, and it looks like there's a situation where someone's taking advantage of someone else, that's a different story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something where we want to have a discussion with the other parent. We want to make sure that, kind of what really went on, how distressed is the child or children about it. And of course, we could go down a whole dark hole here, but I don't know that we need to, especially when we're talking about healthy sexuality. When there are questions about what if something it was unhealthy or potentially dangerous or hurtful, it's always good to check in with your pediatrician, and potentially, they may refer you to Health and Human Services.
So there's options, and addressing it is incredibly important instead of ignoring it.
And without reaction.
Reaction. I think sometimes parents feel like maybe I didn't see what I saw, or maybe that wasn't what I saw, or, and instead of addressing it in a healthy way, kind of pushing it aside almost. So like you were saying, addressing it is important. And what I kept going back to is like, do the brave thing, mama, do the brave thing, mama. If you're a little nervous about it, just do the brave thing, because that's your job. That's your role as a mother and as a parent. So yes,
deep breathing helps a lot. And I mean that. It's actually in my workshop, it's a slide that says, breathe. It's super important, because if we don't breathe, we're not grounded. And then when we respond to our child or ask questions of our child, it's going to come from a not grounded place, which will be reactive, and they will smell that 10 miles away. And so I think I've told you, I've had people contact me where they said, this thing happened. I was freaking out inside, but I called my friend. She went to your workshop and she told me not to freak out and to call you immediately. And so I was just so grateful that happened, because it really, the way that I look at it is it saved a child from probably some pretty indelible shame. That wasn't necessary, because once I calmed this woman down and educated her, she was like, oh my gosh, okay. Like she was much more grounded and really understood that what was happening was actually developmentally accurate and normative.
Yeah. So when you're talking to teenagers, I guess maybe we'll talk about that. Do you feel like I don't have teenagers, but I feel like we should at least talk about that for sure. I don't want to exclude that. Do you feel like they tend to be pretty open when they're talking to their parents, or is that a harder conversation to have, more challenging conversation to have versus when they're young? Because when they're young, from my perspective, they just don't understand all of it. They're just so young. But when they're teenagers, they start to understand a little bit more, and they can have more conversations with you about it. So what are your suggestions in that age group?
I do want to say that they understand a lot more than you think they do. That's why these books are written for that early age group. And again, once we can get them on board that this is normal functioning in the body, healthy functioning, it again sets that foundation for when they do go into those pubertal years, that it just makes sense. Like, oh, this is just the next thing that happens. For puberty, I like parents to really look at puberty from, as I call it, it's not a way station, it's a transformation station. A lot of parents look at adolescence like, please God, make it end, and drag their knuckles through it. But really, it is actually one of the most open times in terms of access to your child's brain, even though they might be sitting there like this, la, 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 I can't hear you. They are listening, they can hear you, and they have so much gray matter going on in their brain at that point that they are sponges. That's why they learn so much. And it's also a time of differentiation and remodeling for adulthood. Their brain is pruning away old information. And it's also the time for them to build skills. So what I like to say is that it's a critical time for us to help them develop those that muscle of decision making. If we don't help them build that muscle, they don't know how to do that. And that is super important for sexuality, of course, because it's one of those things that's kind of, swept under the rug. So we don't always talk about it. But so then how do we expect them to learn good decisions unless we are teaching them? And so really just adolescence is a time of, although it's educating, it's also a time of listening. You're probably in adolescence will do more listening about what's going on with them than you are lecturing or educating. So it's really important to develop that listening, and also to respect and trust the wisdom, the great wisdom that teenagers have. A lot of people think, we think because they make quote dumb choices, or what were you thinking kind of things, that we don't think they have credibility. But what we know, there's a research study that shows that actually when they are alone and making decisions, actually they make the same sort of level and quality of decisions as adults. But when they tend to sort of fall down on the job a little bit is when they are with other teenagers, of course.
Yeah.
So really helping them with that critical decision making. And how do we do that? But by educating them and by giving them information and things to watch out for and things to look for. It's a time where there's just so much opportunity if we can connect with our kids. And some will shut their ears and not want to listen and think they know it all, but that should not deter you as a parent. Would you stop them? You wouldn't stop saying, oh, you don't have to brush your teeth because you don't want to do it anymore. No,
right.
You would keep telling them, you got to brush your teeth. And the same thing is here. You wouldn't stop talking to them about alcohol or drugs. Nope, you'd keep talking. But for some reason, sexuality gets us tweaked enough that we drop the ball, and it can have dire consequences. And it can also have painful relational consequences. Absolutely.
Well, yeah, because then they're not going to come to you at all. I mean, then they won't approach you at all. So that's a lot. I'm trying to wrap my head around everything that we've talked to. No, I'm just, it's great information. I'm just thinking about it. And, in these conversations, you can't help but do some self-reflection. And how does this affect us? Do you need to take a really quick pause?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, you're fine. We can definitely take a pause. That's what's great about all this is we can take a pause and edit it out.
Gosh.
So
Thank you.
Yeah. No, actually that gives me a second to kind of collect my thoughts on here. My head's just like spinning with all of this. It's great. Do you have any other tips or tricks? I mean, I love your suggestions on reading children's books or reading age appropriate books to the kids. We are big advocates of our library, big advocates of read aloud time and book reading. So to me, that's a huge resource, just knowing that there's literature out there for both children and parents. We've talked about the terminology to use, and there's other information out there too. If they have any questions, they can always contact you directly.
Absolutely.
And you do one-on-one consultations. But in terms of creating these sex positive households and raising sexually healthy children, do you have any other words of wisdom or tips for us in how that starts at home?
Sure. I do have one other topic that we haven't talked about that always comes up in workshops, which is pornography or explicit images. That is something I have 2 slides on it in my presentations, because it's always a topic that parents struggle with, because basically if you Google free porn, in 0.31 seconds, you'll get 229 million hits that will show up. And that just gives you an idea, it's not going away. We cannot fight it. We can't make it go away that our children are seeing. It's not something that's realistic. So what's really critically important is knowing that children see pornography or explicit images intentionally, and they also see it accidentally. A lot of it is due to normal curiosity. Like, I'm going to Google boobs, I'm going to Google breasts, whatever. And they're going to get an eyeful. And if, like I said, if they have unmonitored computer access, then they have a passport to the world, and you have to make sure that, does your kid know how to use their passport? Probably not. The internet is a place, and if we wouldn't send our 6-year-old to the mall by themselves, we shouldn't send them on the computer by themselves. But we do know that about, and I'm sure the number changes all the time, but about 1 in 10 kids under 10 have seen pornography. And so what we want to do with that is we want to make sure that we're not, as one, there's a very well-known, I forget her name right now, sex educator who teaches a lot of workshops on this. She said that, we are unteaching before we ever teach. It's one of the few things that happens with. Kids are seeing this stuff because we haven't talked to them about it. And then we have to unteach what they've been taught. And
Mhm.
so it's really important that we let them know that it exists, what to do about it if they see it. And so one way that we can do that is we can, again, make sure that we stay positive. We don't shame the child if we find out that there's a cache on their computer that has this in it. We want to make sure that we're curious with them about, hey, I found this on the computer. I'm wondering, can you help me understand how you got there? And, what have you been looking at? Calm, just like you're asking them, a regular question. We want to start young, meaning if they are on the computer again and they have access, we want to let them know that there are images on there that adults create that involve naked people. And those things are not healthy for kids' hearts, bodies, and brains. And Amy Lang says that on the West Coast. She's a great educator. And I love that. And we want to make sense. We also just want to make sure that we're keeping our mind open, that this doesn't mean that our child has been ruined for life. This is a teachable moment. And consider monitoring software, something like Custodio that actually will keep this stuff filtered out. But so some people want to know, like, what can I say to my young child if this happens? And something you could say that, as I started to say before, that there are people who look at pictures or videos of other people having sex on the internet. And this is called pornography. And this is something that's not for kids, because sex is not for kids. Your heart, your body, and your brain are not ready for that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And so since it's not a healthy thing for your brain, if you do end up seeing this, I want you to be able to come to me and tell me, so we can make sure that we're protecting your brain from this stuff that you're not ready for. So
Mhm.
that's a very calm way to let them know. And, and then if it happens, when they're older, older kids that are seeing porn, you can let, meaning like kind of the over 9, you can kind of the same beginning, but let them know that this is not something that is for kids, because it doesn't represent what a healthy relationship would look like, or any relationship that you will have.
Mhm.
Also, that it's not education, because relationships and sex aren't going to look like this for you. And then tell them what it is. It's meant to thrill and hook you into something that for your age group is really not, again, healthy for what you're learning about sex and relationships in your developing brain.
Mhm.
And let them know that if they have questions, they can come to you, or give them some books about healthy relationships and healthy sexuality.
Mhm.
So that's a start, opening those conversations with our kids, but they need to happen. It's out there and they will see it.
Mhm.
I can't
Yeah.
tell you the amount of kids that see it accidentally, or a firewall was down, or they saw it over someone's shoulder and then they want to go look. But that's all. It's just natural curiosity when they see something that they're like, oh, what's that? Let me go check it
Mhm.
out.
Mhm. So do you suggest that as parents you have that conversation in a way before they've come across it? Do you try
Yes,
Okay, so you're suggesting
absolutely.
to educate without showing them necessarily what it is, but out there on the internet there is something called pornography, and this is what it is, and this is why it's out there, and this is why it's not healthy for you at this point.
For children in your brain.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. I
Okay.
will tell you, I'm not a parent and a professional in my line of work that
Mhm.
I'm going to demonize pornography. And I'll tell you
Mhm.
why. Because at some point in my son's lives, they may choose to look at it to augment their sex life, or to share it with somebody else, or whatever they use it for. But what I
Mhm.
don't want them to hear in their early adulthood or later adulthood, my motherly shaming words that pornography is dirty and bad and you're bad if you look at it. That's
Mhm.
not something I want to do. Again, I trust them that because I've given them the information about what this is and how it's like drinking soda. It
Yeah.
gives you no nutrients. It gives you no health benefits. It's meant to cause an effect for you, give you a
Mhm.
sugar hit, or have some amazing kind of, crazy taste, like this new mango Pepsi, which I don't understand. Um, but it's similar in that way, that I say to my kids that this is out there and
Mhm.
you're probably going to come across it. And when you do, what I can tell you is, it's not really healthy for your brain as it's developing and growing, and it doesn't represent what you're going to see in a relationship. Therefore, it doesn't really have a lot of nutritive value for you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's both literature, but it's also my own values around
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that, because again, we keep going back to this proactive approach, right? As parents, we tend to be reactive, but almost
Yes.
everything that we've discussed today in this episode is being proactive. And we've given so many people the tools and resources, or at least the start of tools and resources, to be brave. I keep going back to that word too. Be brave, mama, and take a proactive approach. I just feel like that would be, in my mind and in our household, we just feel like that would be so much, I don't want to say easier, but I don't want to have to uneducate them. Like what you were saying, I
Right. The
want to
unteaching.
educate,
Yeah.
unteach. Yes. I want to be the person that tells them about this stuff, that they're not finding out about it from another kid or a peer or a teenager, or,
Or that they see this online. What often
yes.
happens with the parents
Yeah.
I've worked with is that their kids have seen pornography online, are like,
Mm-hmm.
oh my God, and sort of scared or, a little bit terrified. But if they know ahead of time, like, oh, that's that thing. Oh, that's that thing my mom or my dad told me about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's not something that's healthy for me. I should probably close that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like similar to sex. Talking about pornography with children does not make them more likely to look at it. It's
Right.
again the inverse. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually the opposite of that.
Right. Yeah. I think sometimes when we talk about this, raising sexually healthy children, people, and I just want to address this just so everybody is, so we clarify that we're talking about this in terms of not encouraging, like you were saying, encouraging our children to have sex or, sexual experiences at an early age. We're hoping to educate them to squash the shame and create a sexually healthy environment for them, because I think there's sometimes this fear that if we talk about it, or if we address this or whatever, then they're going to go out and they're going to have sex. So for me, it's really important to have this sort of sex positive household. And the idea behind that is we're approachable parents. We're a parents that they can come ask us questions, but still creating these healthy boundaries without without
Mhm.
shaming, without
Right.
saying, if they come to us, the last thing that we want to say is, you have to wait until you're married. And that's just like our absolute blanket statement. So here, at least we have tools and resources so we can approach it in a very healthy way and say what's healthy for you with your age and etc. And we haven't determined all of that at this point in our personal values. But so I guess maybe my question for you would be, if you have parents that are coming at you and saying, well, I'm kind of afraid to talk about this with my children, or I like the idea of creating a sexually healthy environment or sexually healthy household, but I'm afraid that it's going to encourage them to explore their sexuality or have sex, whatever you want to call it, at an earlier age. And I really want them to maybe wait.
Well, what we know is there is no literature to that effect, that
Mm-hmm.
talking about it actually creates or encourages it's actually the opposite. Like we
Mm-hmm.
know that the research states that for states that have comprehensive sex education, which means you get taught both abstinence as well as birth control methods, with comprehensive sex education, we see that kids wait longer. The more education they have, the more wisdom they have, therefore they can make better decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really what's important. There is no research that says that, by talking about it, they're going to, and I'm not saying there's no research, like no research has been done. There's no research that bears that out. It's
Right.
just not true.
Okay.
It's just not true.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
That's
a
great.
myth. That would
It's a
be, yeah,
myth.
myth.
Yes. Yes.
It's a myth.
Okay. all of this is great. My head's just spinning because I have so many thoughts going on in my head. So
Yeah,
Jennifer,
we haven't even talked about, like, because I do in my workshops, I also talk about gender variance and gender independent kids, non-binary kids, like making
mhm,
sure that there's an inclusive environment in your home, because you don't know what sort of what choices, not choices, what sort of as your child is developing and growing, who they're going to become. So
mhm,
we don't know that. We don't know that at birth, and we don't know that as they grow. And so making sure, so for example, for my kids, I always said, is there someone special at school? And then when they say yes, I always say, is it a boy or a girl? And I've always left that door open. That doesn't mean that just because you're a boy, you have to like a girl. And my
mhm,
kids know all about everything in between, and non-binary folks. And
mhm.
so just, inclusivity is a big sort of value for me. So of course, if any of your listeners have questions about that, I have lots of resources around that
Mhm.
too.
I love your question and how you approach that question is there somebody special? Instead of, do you have a boyfriend? Oh,
Do
do
you
you
have
have
a
a
boyfriend?
girlfriend?
Yes. Yeah.
I
Put them
I
in a
love
box.
that. Yes. And I just want to clarify, and I think you've already said this too, that there's no shaming parents if they ask those questions because it's just what we've all known. And
Yep.
we say them because we've always said them, but there are different approaches that we can take now that, like you said, are more inclusive in terminology, and we're all starting to kind of try and navigate that. And so it's okay, but that's why we're having this conversation, right? That's why you and I are talking,
Yes.
Jennifer, is to open the door for this dialogue and to kind of have us take a pause and say, is this an inclusive conversation? Is this an inclusive
Right.
approach? Or is this approach or what I'm saying just because this is all I was taught or I know? So I love that. And you probably didn't even realize, but I'm going to take that. You just said that so nonchalantly, but it was just like a huge light bulb for me. Like, yes. Oh my goodness. Even a question like that, we really need to make
I
sure
don't
that
want
we're
to
being
box
inclusive.
any children in. I want
Yeah.
everybody to
Yeah.
be the full expression of who they are. I know that's,
Right.
again, as a sex therapist, it's a big value for me. You had asked earlier, Amy, like, okay, what are some tools? What are some of
Hmm.
the things? And I did say breathe is super important, even though people
Yeah.
think it's a throwaway. It's not. You can only ground yourself and bring your cortisol level if you can breathe and ground yourself. And just a facts, if you take your facts plus values, that equals an empowered child. That's what we want. Give them medically accurate facts, give them your values. That's an empowered child. We want to start early so they are more receptive because they are little sponges. We want to make sure that we own our awkward.
Hmm.
Super important. It's like, the bad sex ed movies that you see, where the sex ed teacher is like the gym teacher and there's all kinds of joking and innuendos. It's because, we've been taught that talking about sex is awkward. We want to make sure that we own it. If we're flushing in the face when you're trying to talk, doing your first time trying to talk about this, or your neck is turning red and you can feel it, own it. Say, hey, you know what? No one ever did this for me. No one
Hmm.
talked to me about this, and I love you so much. That's why I'm doing it. So just know sometimes I may not have the right words, or my face might look a little funny, but I know how important it is. So really own that awkward, put it out there for your child, because when they see us anxious, they often want to do two things. They want to run away and be swallowed by a hole because they wish they could get away from it,
Yeah.
or they want to try to save you, like, no, 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 it's okay, you don't have to talk about it now, it's okay, it's okay.
Hmm.
So we want to make sure that we are responsible adults and own our own awkward.
Hmm.
And for the older kids, we want to make sure, remember the brain, it acts a little bit different than we're used
Hmm.
to. There's a lot of changes going on. There's risk-taking behavior. If you never let your child pull up on a table when they're little, they don't learn to walk. They don't learn to go. Same thing with some risk-taking behavior. Learn how to help make good choices so they don't take bad choices. Open-ended questions, not yes, no. When they get older, ask, how did you feel about that? When she said that to you, how did you feel? What
Hmm.
did you notice, in that movie that we just watched that happened between those two? Ask open-ended questions. Getting to them first and often, again, as early as we possibly can. And that really important for parents to know that when we teach and we understand healthy sexuality, that that can also help prevent sexual violence.
Hmm.
And that's really important. That the more that they know that, again, consent, what an enthusiastic yes is, we can also prevent sexual violence. So we want to make sure that's happening. And the more that you have a relationship with your teen around these topics, that's kind of the best defense in terms of, helping them shepherd them through their adolescence, is making sure that we have started young, that we've built this foundation around talking about sexuality. So again, as I said earlier, when the stakes are higher, we have a good relationship about this stuff and can help shepherd them through that. So that's some tips.
No, I love that. So we talked about some of the children's books. Do you have a couple of
Yes,
books for parents to
sure.
read too?
Absolutely. Oh yeah. I mentioned the Roby Harris ones. Some good ones for parents. Let me think what I would pull up. One that I've always enjoyed by Reverend Hafner, Deborah Hafner, is From Diapers to Dating, a parent's guide to raising sexually healthy children, I think is what it's called.
Okay.
So Deborah Hafner. And for those who haven't read, I talked about the brain and what's going on. It's so important, whether if you haven't read either The Whole Brain Child for younger kids or Brainstorm for adolescents, it is just, especially for adolescents, it is absolutely just mind-blowing what's going on. And I think when we have a great appreciation for what's happening in their brain, we have more empathy for our adolescents. So that's a good one. For those who have same parents, by oh God, what's her name? Leslie Newman, I think it is. Mommy, Mama, and Me, and Daddy, Papa, and Me. That's a very sweet book. For fathers of daughters, Fathers and Daughters by Joe Kelly. I really love New Moon Girls, which puts out a magazine as well as an online magazine. Super wonderful for like empowering that, kind of age 8 and up. And Joe, who's part of that organization, wrote Fathers and Daughters, and there's a chapter on sexuality in there. One of my favorite books for moms is by Joyce McFadden. She wrote Your Daughter's Bedroom. She also updated that book and put it out, I think like a year ago, called Modern Mothering. That book to me was earth-shattering. I read it and immediately wrote a white paper on girls and masturbation for all of my workshop participants. Why it's important is she talks about her research of the conversations that mothers and daughters have and the ones that they don't, and how the ones that they don't end up being the really critical ones. So really, really good book. And if we're trying to think if there's anything else. Great book, Raising a Transgender Child by Michelle Angelo and Ali Bowman. So many good ones. For your listeners who've had little ones that have come into their family from all different wonderful directions, like I mentioned earlier, Dr. Sandy Karen, who's here in Maine with me, she wrote Birds and Bees and More, How Babies and Families Form. And it just covers every different way that a child can come into a family.
I love that. And that's a children's book, you said? That's also a children's
that
book.
is, yeah. Okay. And there's
I think you've told me that
one other children's
before
book
too. I think you've told me about that one before, and the Modern Mothering.
And I think I mentioned Corey Silverberg's books. I think I have it behind me. How Babies Are Made, and I always forget the title of the other one, but Corey Silverberg is the author of the 2 other children's books. They're very inclusive. So plenty of great reading materials, including all the Roby Harris different books. There's plenty out there to help us get us going. And it is really such a wonderful way to integrate your kids into learning, because reading books together is a way that they are used to learning. So it's very natural to do that.
Yeah, I love that. And I will make sure to put all of those books and the authors in the show notes so people don't have to go back. You don't have to go back and listen to this again. I'll put it all in the show notes for you so you can access it that way. So,
Excellent.
okay. Well, Jennifer, you're amazing. You're beyond amazing. I
Thank
think
you
it's
so much.
I think it's very important for people to know that you do consultations, that you make yourself available for some of these specific questions for people. So if people have questions, they can reach out to you. You also have your workshops. You have numerous ways that people can join in kind of that group setting. And a lot of you said you do your workshops through Zoom. Do you do them through Zoom?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Okay.
do. And the best thing is get your village together. I call them village style. Have somebody host it, get all your friends, and we do a Zoom workshop. And whether it's raising sexually healthy children birth to 8 or the 9 to 16, either one.
Yeah. And you and I talked, and I'll just put it out here on the show. If we want to do it through the Mama Mindset podcast, if we want to do it through our community, if people reach out to me and let me know if I have enough people sign up, we'll do one just
We'll
here
do
within,
it.
in our
Absolutely.
community here. And Jennifer, you can lead it. And I think that would be incredibly powerful and gives some chances for some one-on-one question and answer type scenarios as well.
Oh yeah, and they'll get all the education that they need to get them started. They'll get the PowerPoint, they get all the resources. Because in addition to just some of those books, I also make sure that I keep current online just articles and different podcasts to listen to. And they can certainly go to my website. I have lots of interviews and things on there on this subject matter as well.
You do. And they're great. They're great resources.
Thank you.
They're absolutely free, which is amazing. And then your workshops, just to clarify, do you split your workshops up to 2 different age groups? Is that correct?
Yes. Birth to age 8, 9, and then the 9 to 16. I do those separate, and they're 2 hours and 45 minutes long, just shy of 3 hours. Yeah.
Okay. So if we're interested, if we can get enough of a group, we just do need to know the age group that they're looking at.
Yes.
So then we can, if we have enough people that are interested in it, we can do 2 separate workshops with the 2 separate groups. So we'll just see what people want to do. And I have nothing planned or put together, but I just want to put that out there.
You're just being great and putting it out there.
I'm just putting it out there. I mean, I feel like it's calling us to take this just a step further if people are interested, because I know that my head is spinning with just so many thoughts. And so I want to encourage moms and listeners to take a step, take a minute and breathe like you suggested and dissect this, let it just kind of marinate. And you don't have to do all of the things that we talked about in this episode. You don't have to drastically change what you're doing in your approaches, but take little steps, be mindful and intentional. And then if you have any questions, as you slowly move forward down this journey of creating this healthy, sexually healthy household and raising sexually healthy children, that you just are intentional, mindful, and I hope they know that you are a wonderful resource. The books you suggested are a wonderful resource, and we can all make some little changes that make really, really big impact in their lives.
Yeah. And Amy, one thing I think we should mention, because this comes up a lot, is sometimes when we start talking about this, that we realize that there are aspects of our own sexuality as parents that are have been harmed, have been violated, have been negative, have been incomplete. And so I also do consults for adults, individuals, as well as couples, where you get a curated experience and an educational plan of how you can work through that. It's not therapy, so it's something I can do all across the United States. And I have an entire page of testimonials just from this past year of doing them. It's something I've created myself, and I'm so glad I did, because it's helping so many people. So if people are listening and starting to feel some of their own anxiety about their own sexuality, there's a resource for that too.
Yeah, that is so great, because it's hard not to start doing some self-reflection and how we were raised or experiences that we've had. Was this healthy? Was this unhealthy? So,
and it's hard to pass on healthy messages if we feel that we learned really unhealthy ones or have a lot of shame about it. So some people need a little bit of that tidying up in order to get ready to do this with their own children.
I love that you have that approach, Jennifer, and that you're so well-rounded with that. So thank you so
Thank you.
much for all of your
Thank you so
knowledge.
much.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
I hope that we can have you back on the episode again, or back on the podcast again. I'm sure that this
Sure.
will stir up some other questions, and maybe on another podcast episode, we start talking about sexuality within ourselves as mothers and pleasure within as us as women and
Ourselves as
motherhood.
mothers. Yeah.
Yeah, that could be a whole other conversation we
That's a
haven't even
whole nother
dove
can
in.
of worms.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. I really
You're
appreciate you.
welcome.
We'll talk to you
Thanks so much
soon.
for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Bye.